everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be painting this beautiful photo that I found on Pinterest. It's of Lily Harvins and I will have her Instagram linked in the description. When I saw this photo, I just fell in love with it so much that I just had to paint it. So shout out to Lily for letting me paint it for this video. For the art supplies that I'm using, these are actually a few art supplies that I haven't used in a while. I'm using my old brushes, a sketchbook that's been hiding in storage for some reason, and also a few of my watercolor pans that I haven't used in a while. These colors are from Prima Marketing in their Essence palette. And I will also have some of my newer Paul Rubens colors to mostly just complete the color palette. But the sketchbook, I think, is beautiful. The paper is Fabriano Artistico and this was bound by Craftel.ph on Instagram. So I will also have them linked in the description. So I started with a clean sketch because it's really needed for this piece where I wanted to preserve the bold shapes that the highlights are making. I get asked about how I transfer my sketches to my watercolor paper. And while there are a few ways to do that, this one was just traced the old-fashioned way. I just did the sketch digitally on my iPad and then traced over it in a dark room with the iPad's brightness on full blast so I could see it through the thick paper. But yeah, I really needed a clean line work for this. And not only that, I want to talk about these colors that I'm using, and especially 103 Eternity. It's such a lovely, cool green that it's almost blue. This is one of the colors that made me first like green, because before this, green was really my least favorite color. I would have it in my paintings, but mostly it's to cut through the reds that I would have in abundance in my older paintings. But I got this set after I watched Juicy Ink's review on them, and I'm so glad I did. Not just because of the green, but I also love the brown in this palette so much. I think it's probably one of my all-time favorite colors. This one is called 97 Adore, and while I like Eternity so much, it still is like more of a novelty color for me. Sometimes I would use it to drive a piece, but I don't really see myself using it as much as I use Adore. The specific brown has purpley undertones to it that I just don't have a lot of duplicates of in my other palettes. And sometimes I would even use it in pieces where I only mostly am using colors from a specific brand because I just love this color so much. So I really enjoyed filling out the background with these two colors especially, and I loved it so much that I went back and fleshed the background out more than I initially intended. My plan was just to have this one layer background, and it's mostly for the purpose of framing the subject and making the highlights stand out more. But because I enjoyed watching these two colors interact so much, I just ended up having to add more to it. When it came to painting the main subject and painting out the shadows that's framing the highlights, I started using the colors from my Paul Rubens palette, and while I still used Adore for the darker shadows and Eternity for the cooler parts of the shadows, I did mostly just use the yellow ochre and the orange from my Paul Rubens set to really set it apart from the background, because it is just very similar looking colors altogether. I was really surprised at first that the green worked so well as this bounce light that's hitting her jaw. It's a very cool color, and so I had actually planned to use blue for it, but I realized too late that I didn't have a blue in the palette that I picked out before I started, so I ended up having to use Eternity, which I used in abundance for the background. So I was really nervous about that, but when watered down, it actually worked really well, I think. Just as this color that stands in contrast to the warmer shadows of her face. When I think about the colors for this piece, I really think that the Paul Rubens colors are mostly just supplemental colors to the Prima. I think that the colors that I picked out from my Prima Essence set is what really drove this piece, and I just really needed these bright, warmer colors from the Paul Rubens set to go through the darker, cool main colors. So now I want to talk about the paper. It's Fabriano Artistico, which I don't use that often. When I got this sketchbook was, I think, around the time I was first starting out with watercolors, so it was really important for me to experiment, and so I needed watercolor paper that wasn't that expensive. So I was drawn more to using my Bao Hong watercolor papers, especially since those come in blocks. And so I sort of forgot about the sketchbook. Then now that I also use gouache, I just prefer using smoother paper. But when I think of the quintessential cold-pressed pure cotton paper, this is the paper that comes to my mind first. I think the texture is just more natural than the Bao Hong, so it feels more organic than the Bao Hong's just repeating uniform texture pattern. And it just feels so great to finally use it again. And also just having a texture at all feels like a novelty now that I've been using a lot of smoother watercolor paper lately. But yeah, just the texture of the paper really has a hold on the watercolors, and so it gives you more control over your paints. But it also isn't restrictive. It feels like the water and the paints still can interact and move into each other in a way that's just so beautiful. And it also just really encouraged me to paint in so many layers on it. And so even though I haven't used this as often as my other watercolor papers anymore, this is still the best watercolor paper that I can recommend to people who paint with lots and lots of layers and enjoys the texture, the rough texture. And also if they paint with watercolors exclusively, this is one of the best papers for that purpose. I had a hard time with the details on her face, especially on her left eye, where I think I almost lost it completely by trying to get the values on the shadows right. So it's really hard to build up darker details on top of the already dark shadows. But I think what helped was just having this very fine brush that I have. And I really like this. I've been using it for a while. It's not labeled, but I think this is a Sakura watercolor brush that I got from the oil paint store. I really liked using it to paint the details. I even enjoyed it when I was painting the hair strands, which is something that I wouldn't normally enjoy just because it's such an intricate process. But I really liked it. This one maintained its shape really well, and also it just has a really fine point that I think was very essential in painting these final watercolor details. When it felt like I finally had a good foundation set with the watercolors, then I used gouache to really finish off the piece, and this is mostly just white and yellow. The other colors that I mixed in with that are just the watercolors from the Paul Rubens. And this was the part that I was most excited and nervous about. I was excited because I knew that this was when I would really start to see the final picture building. And also when I'm watching painting videos, this is also the part where I think is most exciting. But I was really nervous because I wasn't sure how the gouache would lay down on top of the very textured paper. And I think it's because the great things about the texture that I raved about before, which makes it amazing, which makes the paper amazing for watercolors, but are also what makes the paper not really all that great for gouache. I was still right, it wasn't really that enjoyable at first. Just having that much texture on paper doesn't really make it the best for gouache. It just interrupts with the flow of the thick gouache too much for it to be enjoyable, I think, at first, but I did eventually get the hang of it. I just needed to add more water to it so it would sink into those textures more. But after that first hiccup, I still really loved using the gouache with the painting. I really think that it did its job in finishing the picture that I initially started with the watercolors. So that was really fun, and I'm hoping it's also really fun for you guys to watch. So after all that, I did end up using my Copic opaque white to clean out the highlights more. I really love this thing. It's just so reliable. It's so opaque that it works really well in putting in these very bright whites that you might want to put in your paintings. It doesn't really work for paintings where the highlights aren't fully white, because then it would just stick out too much, but for paintings like this where I really left out the highlights as just the plain paper, I think it worked. I also really love watching this part of the video. I think it's because we finally get to see the painting finish, and I think it ties everything together. We're going back to the highlights, which, although this is one of the last things I painted, it is still one of the first things I carved out when I painted the shadows around it, so it feels like it's going back full circle. This was also one of the only paintings where I think I enjoyed painting the background as much as the main subject. And it's a combination of things. One is how I talked about before. It's that the paper really takes the layers really well. And another thing is that it's not overly detailed. So this is mostly just a play on the colors creating the illusion of specific shapes, rather than just me painting trees and the forest. So it's a lot less pressure, and also just once again, I really love those colors together, and so I loved seeing them interact with each other and layering them. So yeah, especially just the bluish green fading out into the dark background. It's just so inspiring, and it's maybe starting to sound very repetitive, but I really love these colors together. And I think it's a great way to finish the piece. So yeah, that is it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed painting it. Thank you again to Lily Harvent for letting me paint your photo. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me. Thank you guys for watching, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.